You are listening to rudolfsteineraudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, steinerbooks.org in America and rudolfsteinerpress.com in England, who are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of a collection of lectures by Rudolf Steiner, number 167 in the collected works. The book is entitled The Human Spirit, Past and Present, Occult Fraternities and the Mystery of Golgotha, translated by Matthew Barton. It is 12 lectures given in Berlin between the 13th of February and the 30th of May, 1916. Lecture 1, given on the 13th of February, 1916. We will hear a recitation of poems by Friedrich Lienhardt and Wilhelm Jordan, and following this I would like to reflect on contemporary life from an anthroposophic and literary perspective. This will end the evening. First, though, I wish to say a few words by way of introduction. Friedrich Lienhardt is a modern poet who, we can say, has to some degree come close to spiritual science through his own endeavor. On 4 October last year, 1915, Friedrich Lienhardt celebrated his 50th birthday. In Dornach, we joined our voices to the numerous good wishes from far and wide that were sent to this spirit-filled poet. And it is my belief that we have particular reasons to look a little more closely at the content and artistry, the poetic nature of Friedrich Lienhardt, who in some ways has affiliated himself with our movement and regards it favorably. He himself says that he was born in French Alsace and that he experienced some difficulties in wrestling his way through to what he calls his worldview, which he increasingly sought to bring to the light of day, to develop and elaborate from a Central European German quality. In his poems, he really sought to unfold the authentic impetus of this Central European German nature. In this poet, there lives something which he felt to have an intimate affinity with his being, and which, as I have tried to describe, he sought and strove for. An element lives in him whose value may perhaps only properly be understood from the artistic and spiritual perspective of spiritual science. In Lienhardt's poems, we have, above all, wonderful descriptions of nature, lyrical nature poems, but of a very distinctive kind. When he tries to write human utterances, though, these are also nature poetry. Here, too, there is something that emanates from human nature in an immediate and natural way, and reveals the spirit within natural existence. What is this due to? It originates in something that we may perhaps only properly heed in Friedrich Lienhardt if we consider not only the content, the thoughts expressed in his work, but also the intrinsically artistic form they are embodied in. Readers aside, let me spell Lienhardt's last name in case anyone wishes to look up his work. It's L-I-E-N-H-A-R-D, Friedrich Lienhardt. End of readers aside. And this is true of all art, although nowadays it has vanished entirely from human awareness in respect of art, and poetry in particular. In the feelings, the thoughts that arise and develop, flare and fade, in this distinctive swelling of his soul experiences, as they come to expression in poetic language, we find something like the sway of an elemental spirituality, a sympathy of the poet's soul with what, as we see it, lives elementally in the etheric world, in nature, behind merely sensory existence, what lives in the etheric world when human nature comes to natural expression, as for instance in the utterances of a child's soul life. If we study the words of Friedrich Lienhardt, it really seems as if elemental spirits arise and move through them. These spirits who, as we know, stream and warm through all natural phenomena, live and weave within them. And this streaming and warming, this weaving life of elemental beings in nature, enters and lives in the words of such a poet, who truly understands how to live in harmony with the spirit of nature. Furthermore, through his capacity to grasp contexts of great scope relating to humanity and the cosmos, with which he has a great feeling affinity, he seeks, without ever lapsing into narrow nationalism, to encompass the driving, active powers and beings of national culture. Yet he does so not by focusing on a randomly individual element, but by drawing on the whole sway and surge of the folk soul principle, placing individual figures into the great spiritual context of national life and culture. Thus Friedrich Lienhardt can comprehend and portray a figure such as Father Oberlin from Steintal in Alsace, someone spiritualized by a kind of atavistic clairvoyance, and do so in a vividly three-dimensional and yet simultaneously intimate, soulful way. Out of this same impulse, he knew how to re-invoke ancient figures of the gods and bring them back into the present. He does not do this, though, by simply taking the content of the old heroic sagas and legends, but by really trying to find the means, in modern idiom, to reawaken the tide suffusing this ancient life, whose waves still lap at the shores of our own times. In a sense, therefore, Friedrich Lienhardt is really one of our most elevated poets. Other modern poets have sought to distance themselves from all real art, from spirituality, by focusing on the naturalistic and realistic in their work, in what they see as a new style. The real poet does not seek to create something new by naturalistic means, though, but by grasping the eternal stream of beauty afresh, anew, in a way that allows art to remain art. And real art, therefore, can never be devoid of spirit. No doubt it is due to this also that Friedrich Lienhardt has come closer to what he calls, quote, paths to Weimar, close quote. For a long time he was the editor of a periodical titled Paths to Weimar, which appeared at irregular intervals, in which he tried to engage with the great ideas and artistic impulses of the great period at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, to discern, as we may find in our concluding reflections, what was of real worth in this era that has now been completely, or at least largely, forgotten. By this means, he sought to deepen his own later artistic culture, to make it more inward, and thus wonderfully inward poems eventually emerged from this endeavor, such as those about St. Odile and other figures. He connects all such things in a genuine, authentic way with the Christian impulses that surge through humanity. And it is remarkable how he so finely and subtly approaches an element, not through the outward content of his poetry, but by drawing on elemental qualities and beings to sustain it, which seemed to have been lost entirely from German poetry. When you hear the recitation, you will notice this in certain passages in the form of alliterative art, alliteration. This alliteration and its affinity with the whole nature of Central European German folk culture leads him close to another poet, who, partly by his own fault, and yet chiefly by the fault of our era and its aberrations, has met with little understanding. The second part of the recitation will be devoted to this poet, Wilhelm Jordan, who, through stave, rhyme, or alliteration, sought to renew what he calls the, quote, resonant stream of speech of ancient days, close quote. It was intrinsic to his nature to reintroduce this form of ancient poetry into the modern era, seeking to raise it above the small scope of the everyday, to encompass great and moving impulses. And it has to be said that it is a terrible shame, although Jordan himself was partly to blame for this, that a poem such as titled The Demiurge, close quote, has remained so neglected. It is a poem which truly attempts to connect the world-moving spirit principles with the life of humanity on earth. In the 1850s, partly due to Wilhelm Jordan himself, it remained neglected. He is partly at fault himself, since he did adopt something of the naturalistic, scientific mode of looking at the world, and this spoiled a good part of his endeavors. In his poem Nibelungen, much was spoiled by the fact that he allowed naturalistic principles of inheritance to hold sway. The material powers of descent from one generation to the next, rather than what older eras saw as much deeper principles. He places too great an emphasis on what passes down through the blood, instead of from soul to soul. By this means, certainly, Wilhelm Jordan paid his tribute to the modern naturalistic and scientific mode. But at the same time, this deprived his works of what in a former era gave human artistic endeavors their great spiritual impulses, preventing them from sinking into inartistic barbarism, which later frequently came to replace former spiritual principles. Today we can see how Wilhelm Jordan's efforts are ridiculed, but we, for our part, should let great impulses work upon us, wherever they appear. For the time will come when such impulses will need to fulfill a certain mission in the whole universal evolution of humanity. Certainly, the poet Friedrich Lienhard meets with great and widespread acknowledgement. But what we in our circles can find in his work and should seek to discover will primarily be what carries his artistic endeavors forward into the future, upon and along with the wave of spiritual scientific endeavors. And now, let us first hear Friedrich Lienhardt's poems, and then some passages from Wilhelm Jordan's Nibelungen poem, The Legend of Siegfried. Bracket, recitation by Frau Dr. Steiner of the following poems by Friedrich Lienhardt: Faith, Morning Wind, Forest Greeting, The Light Creative, Lonely Rock. Did you learn of it too? All the delicate flower bells, Soul Migration, Elfin Dance, Summer Night, Songs of St. Odile, Autumn on Mont St. Odile, St. Odile. Recitation from Wilhelm Jordan's Nibelungen song, close bracket. It is always good to experience the art of poetry, of this kind particularly. In Friedrich Lienhardt we have a poet who tries still to bear into the present era soul experiences of a spiritual idealistic nature, who is strong enough still to unite these with experiences of the natural world. Here we can still sense that in art how you say things is more important than what is said. How wonderfully he conjures a feeling of enchantment in the area surrounding Mont St. Odile, and how beautifully he conveys an immediate lyrical apprehension of the feeling which this patron saint emanates from the region and from the monastery there. The legend according to which he was once persecuted by her cruel father, but, blinded by him, gained the mystical ability, through this very fact, to heal the blind and give them back their sight, forms the center of this poem, around which everything else revolves. Everything of a true mystical nature that relates to this legend, lyrically interwoven with the natural world around Mont Saint Odile in Alsace, comes to expression in the poems by Friedrich Lienhardt that you have just heard. But there are many, many more poems of such power, and at the same time of such intimacy and subtlety by this same poet. The elemental powers resonating from his works does in turn give us cause also to recall the much denigrated and neglected poet Wilhelm Jordan. The small sample we heard today will have shown you how this poet tries to create the figures he places before us out of the great spiritual weft of life, and at the same time to combine this with all we meet in outward physical life, a union of the latter with what weaves and lives in the surging spirit world. It seems to me that in Wilhelm Jordan's work we can particularly discern how the poet's soul unites with world historical currents, so that artistic, poetic endeavor embodies for us a striving that infuses the spiritual streams of evolution. The last time we were here together, last Tuesday, I felt the need to ask what would happen to human evolution on Earth if no spiritual influx could enter what is given us by purely external physical existence. Not only in external fields of knowledge, of science, and in social existence and so forth, but also in the artistic realm, it becomes strikingly apparent that we are living in critical times. We are experiencing a crisis, a word connected with critical, though not in the sense used by the diminutive literature of today. If the living nature of spiritual science does not encompass human soul life, art, which cannot exist without spirit, will be lost to humanity, must fade from us, no longer resonating as it still does from figures such as Wilhelm Jordan and as poets such as Friedrich Lienhardt seek to invoke it. As yet, human beings do not recognize the threat of artistic decline, since in many respects, here also, the intoxication and somnambulistic dreaming I spoke of last Tuesday still holds sway. Much of this could be discerned if people had the organs of vision to perceive it. It would be an excellent thing if more and more people could, through a true feeling for the science of the spirit, gain insight into the significant fact that the art of acting, that really did survive until quite recently, is now sinking into a slough of despond in forms that are anything other than artistic. Reinhardtian principles prefigure what art will become, if nothing remains but an increasingly pervasive self-encapsulation from all spiritual life and spiritual feeling. It is very sad to see today how a great number of people can still regard the spectacles of Reinhardtism as any kind of art. To see clearly in this field, we do need a strong impulse that can emerge from an artistic sensibility kindled by spiritual science. Modernity in art, as it is called, is often nothing more than a confused delirium. If we really try to comprehend modern life, we can actually identify the place, if you like, where an existence entirely consumed by materialism collapses into the swamp of art, or, seen from another perspective, into oblivion of everything that really constitutes art. You see, in order for a real sense of art to keep taking root in humanity's further evolution, what originated in the past and for example, lives also in Lienhardt's poems, a kind of nature pantheism and spirit pantheism needs to develop more tangibly and specifically. People must learn to comprehend the multiplicity of life in a way that enables them to perceive the etheric, astral, and spirit alongside and within sensory reality. Without such perception, humanity will remain blind, especially in relation to art. And specifically in terms of artistic vision, the world will, one might say, come to expression only as the rough-hewn external reality of the senses. Artists will look at this outer reality and describe it directly as it is. But in fact, you cannot give descriptions of this kind, echoes and reflections of sensory reality, without at the same time conveying something that clouds our sense of life with unclarity, offering dream states and befuddlement, in which, basically, we never quite know what we are dealing with. Today, this dizzy delirium in relation to the phenomena of life is frequently regarded as subtle psychology. It often pains me to see how few people have the capacity to feel things strongly enough in this domain, and in some way or other to resist it. The artist has to develop an eye for the deeper life of the world, EYE, to look at others with the soul organs which humanity's evolution has developed in us, and to be able to say, here is a human being with such and such a nature, and he experiences this or that. One person dwells more in his physical body, another more in the I capital, yet another more in his astral body. We need a living feeling for the different characters and characteristics of human beings, informed more by the physical or the etheric or the astral or the I. And if people cannot develop this perception today, but try to describe human beings in poetry, say, all that emerges is the kind of delirium now widely regarded as art. One must be able to get a hold of the essence of significant phenomena, so that we awaken understanding of what actually is. Let us imagine that we meet four people who have some kind of karmic connection with each other. If four such people are brought together, we can understand how karma has involved them in certain relationships with each other, but also how the stream of karma flows through the course of evolution, and how these people, due to their karma, have sought to place themselves into the world in a certain way. We can never understand anything from perspectives possible today if we are unable to perceive these karmic connections in the world. Let us turn for a moment to the four brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, Alyosha, and Smerdyakov, in Dostoevsky's title, The Brothers Karamazov. If we can see with an eye, EYE, of soul, then we find in these four brothers really four types, whom one can only fully understand in terms of the karma that has brought them together. A current of karma brings four brothers into the world, making them the sons of a typical modern rascal amidst degenerate surroundings. They choose this karma and are introduced into this environment as the four sons of this rogue. Yet side by side, we see they are each different in nature. In fact, we can only understand them if we know that in one of them, Dmitri Karamazov, the I predominates, while in a second, Alyosha, it is the astral body. In Ivan, the etheric body is predominant, while in the fourth, Smerdyakov, the physical body holds full sway. If we can consider the four brothers from this perspective, then their life is illumined for us. And now reflect how a poet with the gifts of Wilhelm Jordan and with a spiritual worldview that would accord with our times would place 4 such brothers alongside each other. How he would succeed in comprehending their spiritual foundations and underlying constitutions. What does Dostoevsky comprehend? Nothing more than that these 4 brothers of his are simply the sons of a very typical drunken layabout from a certain stratum of society. The mother of the first son, Dmitri, is a half-hysterical adventuress, who, having had enough of the drunken old layabout Karamazov, can no longer endure him. She beats him, then leaves him with this elder son, Dmitri. But everything is seen only in terms of physical heredity. He is simply the offspring of a wastrel and a walloper. All is described reductively, as if the author were a modern psychiatrist who only considers the coarsest principles of heredity and has no sense of spiritual factors at work. He presents us merely with the, quote, burdens of inheritance, close quote. Then we have the next 2 sons, Ivan and Alyosha, born to a second wife, since naturally these burdens of heredity must act differently in these 2 figures. Their mother is not half, but wholly hysterical, given to continual fits of sobbing and crying. Whereas the old drunkard's first wife often beat him, he now beats her. The 4th son, in whom everything of a physical nature predominates, is Smerdyakov, a kind of hybrid between wise humility and idiocy, of real stupidity and yet also great acuity. He too is the son of the typical layabout, but his mother is dumb, the village idiot named, quote, Stinking Lizaveta, close quote, whom the old drunkard rapes and who dies giving birth. Naturally, no one knows this is also his son. Smerdyakov stays at home, and now all the scenes between these figures unfold as the novel develops. Dmitri, due to the burden of heredity, naturally becomes a person in whom the subconscious I storms and rampages, driving him on through life so that he staggers about without direction. In the way he is described, it is clear that he is not a healthy spiritual figure, but a sensualist and hysteric. But this derives also from inevitable modern developments, which militate against everything that can originate in a spiritual worldview. Everything that does not really know what it wants, unclear instincts, which can equally well become either the loftiest mysticism or the worst criminal excess. Indeed, fueled by the unconscious, there is an easy transition from one to the other, and all this Dostoevsky embodies, in a sense, in Dmitri Karamazov. He wants to describe a Russian, since invoking the true nature of Russians is always his aim. Ivan, the next son, is a rationalist and more Western-oriented. Dmitri knows nothing of the culture of the West, but is rooted fully in Russian instincts. Ivan was in Paris, has studied widely, absorbed a Western perspective and worldview, and as Dostoevsky portrays him as filled with materialistic ideas, which he discusses with everyone. Ideas of Western materialism, but tinged with Russian musing and reflection. In his discussions with people, the fog of instincts is interwoven with all kinds of ideas about modern culture. Should one be an atheist or not, he wonders. Can one accept a God or not? He concludes that one can, after all, accept the existence of God. Yes, he says, I accept God. That is his ultimate position, but he cannot accept the world. If he accepts God, then he cannot accept the world, since this world as it is, as it appears, cannot have been created by God. I accept God, but not the world, he says. The third son, Alyosha, joins a monastery at a young age. The astral body predominates in him. And it is also apparent that all kinds of instincts are at work in him, develop in him, through mysticism too. It becomes clear that, like his elder brother, Dmitri, he too has a potentially criminal nature and is in thrall to the same instincts, although in him these take a different form, making him into a mystic. Criminality is only a particular elaboration of the same instincts, which, diverted in a different direction, can call forth fervent prayer and faith in the divine love pervading the world. Both come from a lower realm, from the lower instincts of human nature, but develop in different ways. Naturally, there is absolutely no objection to portraying such characters artistically, for all reality can become a subject for art. But what counts is the manner of portraying it, not the content itself. These figures must be fully imbued with the living nature of the spirit. Due to the idiosyncratic circumstances I have often described here in relation to Russian culture, what comes to expression in Dostoevsky in particular is the form human evolution must take if Russian life adheres to a spirituality that develops in merely natural ways. Recently I made a distinction between this and the development of spiritual conditions. From the very outset, Dostoevsky was the embodiment of anti-German sentiment, and instinctively refused to allow anything of Western European culture to flow into his soul. He sought to go no further than to grasp cosmic forms and figures in a kind of delirium, letting them pass him by, and carefully avoiding seeing anything spiritual in the physical throng of humanity that surged before his inner gaze. Instead of grasping his characters through profundities of soul, he brought them forth from the subterranean realms of purely physical nature, which in him was pathological. And this had its effect upon those who had forgotten their capacity to raise themselves to the Spirit. A powerful effect was exerted upon them by the, let us call it, pathological bubbling and boiling that acts in human guts and innards, which Dostoevsky's nature was able to transform artistically, but to the exclusion of anything spiritual. This had its effect. Otherwise, of course, a mere description or characterization would be nothing but that, a straw blaze, a wooden portrayal. But since it emerged from a subconscious that was pathological, that acts hysterically, it became interesting, specifically by virtue of the paradox arising if one gives oneself up to purely physical existence without a spark of spiritual life, but does so with feeling. For that is something Dostoevsky possesses to the highest degree. And then we have, interwoven into the Brothers Karamazov, that remarkable episode about the Grand Inquisitor, before whom, as it is presented to us, the reincarnated Christ appears. This is presented as a novella by Ivan Karamazov, incorporated into the book. The reincarnated Christ appears before the Grand Inquisitor, a worthy representative of Orthodox Christianity, who is fully conversant with the nature of Christianity in his age. Picture this: a Christian, a true proponent of Orthodox Christianity, faces the reincarnated Christ. He clearly has no other option. This Grand Inquisitor, who represents proper, in quotes, and lawful, in quotes, Christianity, than to have the reincarnated Christ locked up. That is the first thing he does, for it is his task to hold inquisitions. It becomes apparent that the Grand Inquisitor, who represents due and lawful religion, knows what Christianity in our era requires. He sees that the Christ has come again, and now stands before him. Yes, you are surely the Christ, he says to him. I am rendering this very roughly. But in the concerns of Christianity that we must represent, You have nothing to say, for you understand absolutely nothing about it. What you accomplished, did it do humankind any good? Did it make human beings happy? It was left for us to make something proper out of the one-sided impracticality you brought us. If your form of Christianity alone had come amongst humankind, then people would never have found in it the salvation we have brought them. You see, to really bring human beings salvation, one needs teachings that influence them. You thought that the teaching must be true, but such things get nowhere with humankind. The most important thing is that people should believe the doctrine they are taught, that it is given them in a way that compels them to believe. It is we who have established this authority. Yes, indeed, there was really nothing else to be done than to deliver up the reincarnated Christ to the Inquisition. In the Christianity that the Grand Inquisitor represents, you see, there is no room for the Christ if he should be so tactless as to reincarnate. The idea is grandiose and executed in still more grandiose fashion. But it is interjected into a novel that is only an hysterical reflection of reality, offering nothing of the great impulses at work in the universe, offering no vision of anything spiritual in the author's mind, but only an external counterfeit of Christ, reincarnated and crushed by the Grand Inquisitor. Such things relate to many other matters, and those who seek to comprehend the very pulse of spiritual science need to feel these affinities and not regard life too superficially. There are various things that can characterize the current state of our culture. We need only think, for instance, of two books that appeared not long ago, one of which is titled Jesus, a Psychopathological Study, and the other titled Jesus Christ from a Psychiatric Perspective. Here the message of the Gospels is, as it were, laid out on the psychiatrist's couch. Particular passages are subjected to an examination and diagnosed, in particular the words of Christ Jesus himself, to show the pathological state of this individual who stands at the beginning of modern evolution. The psyche of Christ Jesus is diagnosed as pathological. So, here we have already the case, in quotes, of Christ examined in line with the dictates of modern psychiatry. But we must see such phenomena in a broader context. How many people really feel the full idiocy of a culture where such things surface, really feel all the ramifications of such ideas? Again and again, after all, we have witnessed a renowned psychiatrist to whom folk all run for treatment. He writes innovative works on psychiatry and is accorded great acclaim. There are pupils or colleagues of his who, still following closely on his heels, write psychopathological studies of Goethe, Schiller, Nietzsche, and all sorts of other figures who have a place in history. Write also of Christ Jesus himself. And as we cross the threshold of the psychiatrist or any other scientific observer with misplaced reverence, with unthinking faith in their authority, we are allowing ourselves to be conveyed upon a current that leads in extreme to caricature, to idiocy and distortion. To try to see living contexts clearly is no doubt something that many experience as uncomfortable and seek to avoid. Yet it is necessary to kindle such efforts. We really make no headway at all by gathering together here and with a certain desire for sensation or mystical enthusiasm, simply allowing spiritual science to act upon us. We make progress instead when this spiritual science lives in us and we learn to observe life in terms of the impulses this spiritual science can kindle in us. We are not yet practitioners of spiritual science, because we allow words about elemental spirits or hierarchies and so forth to stream over us once a week, like cold or maybe warm, I have no idea, shivers down our back. We practice the science of the Spirit instead by bringing these things to life within us, relating them to all aspects and details of life. Truly, in observing the quagmires of modern art, we can feel a sense of distaste and disgust, or would do if we do not aspire, like Theosophists, to let universal human love prevail, and therefore avoid calling these quagmires by their proper names. It is curious how reluctant people are nowadays to really open their eyes. Naturally, individuals are not at fault as such. It is the fault of the whole of modern culture. It becomes extremely hard for an individual to see such things clearly, for state education often tries to conceal or ignore things, such as those I have spoken of during this rather disconnected episodic evening. People, in a sense, are drawn away from reality, blinded to it. In this respect, we really live at present in one of the greatest eras of human schooling, and must not overlook what we are given to learn. Think for a moment of the lack of discrimination that exists about the ways in which people relate to each other. For instance, the principle that no differences exist should not lead us to try to erase and confuse all distinctions and nuances, as it led the director of the Theosophical Society when she sought to discount the differences between diverse religions, leaving Hinduism shining in especial glory. Otherwise, she muddied the differences, employing a logic that I have often compared with someone saying that they should use all the condiments on the table indiscriminately. This way of treating all religions in the same way, seeing no differences between them, is more or less like saying that salt, sugar, and pepper are all condiments and can be used indiscriminately. Just try putting pepper in your coffee, sugar in your soup, or curry powder on your dessert, and you will find that there is a difference. But it is this logic, similarly, which blinds people to the real and specific nature of evolution. Many things are muddled like this, so that people are persuaded into a nebulous, foggy kind of dream state. All too easily one is misunderstood when one says these things. For this reason I will expressly state how greatly, as you know, I esteem Tolstoy. But this does not mean that we should forget that there lives in Tolstoy something, of course, that should not simply be equated with Western European culture, painted in one uniform gray with it. In the past, in lectures on Tolstoy, I have often drawn attention to such distinctions. One can admire the greatness of a man like Tolstoy without overlooking aspects of his work that have been ignored. When Tolstoy was still widely read, in particular his first great works, people might, though only might, have seen in him a great spirit of the East, a great Russian author, who was, however, full of the bitterest hatred toward German culture, who disparaged it and disdained it. This was not remarked upon, because the early translators of Tolstoy into German left these passages out or modified them. The unexpurgated translation by Raphael Löwenfeld arrived too late in the day, and by that time German literature had adopted a falsified Tolstoy. Either one should really be fully conversant with things or refrain from judgment. Judgment must be founded on real knowledge. There is no need to overestimate Tolstoy. Clear discernment will show that besides his greatness as a writer, he was also very much rooted in his national culture and emerged from this. We should not just follow the lead of modern small-minded journalists who, while acclaiming the greatness of, say, Goethe or Schiller, use the same words to rave about Dostoevsky. They do so without any sense that, compared with title Wilhelm Meister or title Elective Affinities, or also the works of Lienhardt, even a novel like title The Brothers Karamazov is second-rate in terms of the aesthetic principles we have developed from a previous era. We can form clear, precise, tangible views and judgments when we gain insight into what is. And today we live at a time when we must hone our judgment, gain such insight. In our times, mutual hatred between nations is growing ever greater. And if we wish to make judgments, we have to learn to see how this hatred can develop from what has long existed. These things must be stated so that we develop amongst ourselves something of a feeling for the importance of spiritual scientific endeavor. It is easy to feel rather bitter whenever some newspaper or journal or book prints disparaging and foolish words about theosophy, whereas it would be so important to really grasp the very fundamental efforts and endeavors of spiritual science, without being fanatical about it, of course, but just to accord it its proper place in modern culture. We must recognize that people today cannot really embrace spiritual science, cannot love what it is seeking to achieve, because they cannot even take the few simple steps needed to get beyond the most extreme frivolity, which today pervades most of our cultural life. To engage in serious reflections in a serious time would seem a justified endeavor. Which moment of world history, after all, would be more suited for it than this? A moment in human evolution excessive in its dreadful, terrible nature, though naturally it presents us with great and necessary challenges and developmental opportunities. What moment would be better fitted than this hour of need? To bring this home to us, we need only reflect that in just one large-scale battle in June or July last year on the northern part of the Western Front, as much ammunition was used as in the whole of the German-French War of 1870-71. Experts in such matters estimate that we will soon reach a point in these current conflicts when munitions expended will equal that of all previous wars since gunpowder was invented. This is a grave time, and not one that can permit us to overlook the great spiritual crisis, too, through which humanity's evolution is now passing. The state of things is so dire that it would be unforgivable to avoid looking carefully at the whole importance of what human evolution requires, if we are able to do so by approaching these matters through the teachings of spiritual science. The end of Lecture 1.